What's the worst case scenario here? You have to think about that thing. Obviously, it's a short trip from that to anxiety and paralyzation. But like, if you don't take a minute to go like, hey, what could happen here? And then what can I do to make that a lot less likely to happen? That's, to me, the most basic obligation of a parent. For the Daily Dad launch, Pamela and Barbara, the publicists, are pitching a piece that I suggested to them called In Praise of Overprotectiveness. So you have this, I thought of the title and I thought of like the thing I'm arguing against, but I actually have no idea what would be in this article. And I was going to ask you about it anyway. And so I thought I would ask you about it. So basically the pitch was, okay, like, I feel like amongst our generation or people we know, they're sort of acting like the number one problem of parenting is overprotectiveness. Like, people aren't giving their kids enough space. There's helicopter parenting. There's snowplow parenting. That the number one threat to kids is this like clinging too tight. Of course, reality, the number one threat to kids is like all the number one threats to kids. Like it's guns and cars, drowning in pools and car accidents. It's all this very real stuff that previous generations didn't think about, should have thought about, or when they did think about it, they invented things that made them better. And now we're like, not amongst everyone, but we're, I think in certain circles, overreacting to an overreaction. And like, if you're not overprotective of your kids, what are you protective of?
Why would we be criticized as a generation for like not wanting our kids to die?
That's what I'm saying.
Or like get horrendous head injuries.
Yes.
That's just the most nonsensical thing I've ever heard in my entire life.
But it's not like a straw man I'm arguing against. Like it is a thing. Like it does. Like if you pull up like Instagram reels right now, I think you'd see more parents talking about how everyone is too protective and not like, here are basic things you can do to keep your kids safe.
Well, I think this brings up a larger argument about just general boundaries and guidelines. But I think that we could, since we're talking about this specifically, let's talk about boundaries and guidelines within this specifically. Okay. I think there's a spectrum, right? And you and I happen to be on the same page generally about where we fall on the spectrum of overprotectiveness. We are not the type of parents who are like, we don't let our kids go into pools because our kids might drown in pools.
And I'm not sure those people exist.
And and maybe they do, maybe they don't. We're also not the type of people who are like, let's shove our kids into a pool and they'll make it or break it. We're not like a Spartan parent who are just like shoving our child onto the fucking hillside and
and not that those parents I'm not worried about. I think it's like you go over to someone's house and you're like, you don't have a pool fence? What's wrong with you? This is, of course, taking for granted that people have pools, which they don't all do. But you get what I'm saying.
But we have I'll use grapes as an example.
Yeah.
Because pools are even one, like, whatever.
I think if someone saw you or me cutting up grapes in our house, amongst the parents we know, they'd be like, that's a little extra. And to me, that seems like it takes 2 seconds. It seems better than the alternative.
Okay, but the way that we also think about things are we cut up grapes in our house. There are guidelines about the way that you should cut up grapes. There are parents who like have mats and they're like, this is the age that you're supposed to like cut up your grapes or whatever. I think that's a little more extreme that we generally follow.
What's this mat?
They're like these mats there's like foods. Okay. So you and I do definitely fall on the same page with this, but there are like food cut up guideline mats, like cutting boards that you can buy, so you can like cut up the food based off of like safety guidelines for age.
Oh, okay. So it's just like
choking guidelines,
yeah, sure.
Which like I think some people might need if they're like they don't understand, but like that's not the way I retain information. So, and I don't think it is for you either.
Sure.
Whatever. I also understand, like, we also teach our kids how to, like, appropriately eat food. So from a young age, you pick up a full grape, you bite a grape properly. Sure. So if our kid is ever exposed to food in the wild, in a shopping cart, at a birthday party, if they're picking up a grape, their inclination is to just shove it in their mouth and then inhale or whatever. Like, I think that's a well-rounded way to approach something that could be harmful. And
Sure.
that's the way that we generally
Right.
approach them.
You're minimizing the downside, like you're protecting them from themselves,
Right.
but you're also not leaving them unprotected by not giving them the skills to
Right.
do it themselves.
Like we know that our children are exposed to open water because we live in Texas, so there's a lot of open water in Texas. They're exposed to swimming pools. They're exposed to friends' houses who have pools or community pools. We have a pool. Like they have access to swimming pools. Not all of those are, or open water, not all of those are fence safe. Like
Sure.
we've like make a big effort to get our kids either swimming lessons, or if that's not possible, like, and it hasn't always been possible for us from like just access to being able to get swimming lessons. Like we've like taught our kids skills for safety
Right.
around water.
Sure.
Like, why wouldn't you do that if you have access to do that?
Yeah. Why wouldn't, like, if there's ever a place to be safe rather than sorry, how is it not with your kids?
I can't offer you an alternative view here because I have the same view.
No. I'm trying to talk about what should be in the article. So like, I think that's a good example. It really struck me like when we were in Florida, we were at the beach, and it's like, here's a mom riding her bike with her kid on the back, and neither of them is wearing a helmet. Here's a family driving a golf cart, and they have a 4-year-old sitting in the back seat just hanging on. Or here's a 7-year-old driving said golf cart, and it's like, if you ask these people what their most valuable thing in the world was, they would say their kids. Like, what's the most important thing in your life? They'd say, my kids. Would you do anything for your kids? Yes. And then you're like, okay, then why are you not taking the most basic safety precautions with your kids? How can those two things exist simultaneously in your mind? And the answer is they don't exist simultaneously in their minds. They're not thinking about it.
Yeah, and I think people have like a different risk tolerance where they see those things as being not as risky as we might see them, or they might have been exposed to risk in a different way, or they might have never experienced or seen really tragic accidents in a way that we might have seen. Like you and I have spent time around people in golf carts in that capacity and seen near misses in a way that like makes us never want to put our kids in a golf cart in that way.
I mean, when I was in Mexico, I saw a 10-year-old girl on an ATV on the beach. The wheel gets stuck. She went over the handlebars and it flipped over on her. Like, I was recording with my drone when it happened. And it was one of the worst things that I've ever seen in my life. Thankfully, she was okay. I walked up to her. It looked like all her teeth had been blown out. Like, thankfully, it was like it was a 1 in a million that she didn't get seriously hurt. It was not 1 in a million that it happened. It was very likely that this would happen. You can't put a 10-year-old unsupervised on a quad. That's insane.
But
and I think it's that either the parent wants to have fun so badly they don't want to think about the consequences, or they're just not thinking about the consequences at all. And you know, I for the Stoics, it's like, what's the worst case scenario here? You have to think about that thing. Obviously, it's a short trip from that to anxiety and, you know, paralyzation. But like, if you don't take a minute to go like, hey, what could happen here? And then what can I do to make that a lot less likely to happen? That's, to me, the most basic obligation of a parent.
Okay, so I think you were like missing out on a point in the conversation that you were having, because like where you're going with this when you're talking about it here is don't do these things because it's scary and you're like and like that you're like straddling the line of like of helicopter parent and
Maybe.
like
Okay.
don't participate in anything fun because something bad could happen, right? Don't do these things, whatever. With the beginning of the conversation, we're talking about like risk management.
Well, yeah, I'm actually not saying don't do these things. I'm saying, like, look, driving in a car is dangerous, right? If you were a parent who had zero risk tolerance, you would not ever drive your kid anywhere. But that's not what we're talking about.
Yeah, okay.
A smart parent would say, okay, what's the best car seat? What's the best way? What is the best? What are best practices for putting them in this car seat? And then how do you drive Like how do you drive intelligently? And then you have now taken the vast majority of that risk off the table, out of the picture.
Okay, so car seats are a really good one, right? If a car seat exists on the market, like they've been tested to be safe for use. So like using a car seat that is like appropriate for your child's height and weight is like, pick that one, right?
Yeah.
Using the car seat properly is where parents like mess that up.
Right.
You're using the car seat. You bought the car seat. Install it properly and use it properly.
Yes.
That's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Like that's the like disconnect that you and I are discussing. Right?
I don't know. Is that what we're discussing?
No, I'm saying like in this article, like if you're like mitigating the risk and we're talking about like keeping your children safe, like why if we're talking like tell me the title of your article.
In praise of overprotectiveness.
Like we like be overprotective of your kids. Don't just like put them in the car seat and be like, oh, that's good enough. Like put the fucking
Can't curse on this podcast.
And why is that?
No, I
like
remember.
Put the seatbelt on properly. Like what is preventing you from putting the...
But there are some things you just don't do. Like I was just reading this Joan Didion book, and she was talking about how she was like, parents are so overprotective these days. Like back when I was a kid, we would get drunk in high school and raft down the American River, and nobody ever stopped us or said anything about it. And as I read that, it hit me super hard because 2 of my friends died in high school doing that exact thing. They drank, rafted down the river, drove back, and they wrapped their car around a telephone pole. 2 of them died, and one of them went to jail. Like, and so there is this kind of this thing where past generations and then the future, like they go, we didn't used to do that. Like my parents didn't used to do it, or people didn't used to be this, paranoid about things or overprotective or involved or hovering. And it's like part of the reason that changed is because a lot of the things they were taking for granted then were actually totally preventable and changeable. And this sort of like, well, what are you going to do? Right. Is to me an abdication of your responsibilities as a parent. Like you should be like, if there's one side of it to be on, like not protective enough or overprotective, obviously you should be on the side of being overprotective because you control you don't control what happens, but you do control whether you took a minimum or a maximum of the available precautions.
You sound super judgmental.
I am super judgmental. And don't act like you didn't encourage me. Like you don't bring up on Instagram like all the people we know who don't know how to strap their kids in their car seats.
I think that like when these conversations come up and like we are super judgmental, but like when these conversations come up for us, the first thing that my mind goes to is like, where are the gaps for us?
Well, of course.
And I think that's always
you don't need to be going around judging other people.
Well, that's
you
not
can
what
learn
we
from
do.
other people to make yourself better. But I think the overall point is like,
where are we? Like, I think a lot of these things that come up, especially like the proper car seat usage, is like a gap in like education, right? Or like, let's say swimming pools or like cutting up grapes or whatever. Like a lot of that is probably gaps in education and proper usage. And like, that's
why I think it's
a bigger conversation.
But that's why I think it's so dangerous that sort of privileged, wealthy,
influencers
are like, oh, this doesn't matter. And it's like, it might not matter to you because you already drive, let's say, a very safe car and don't have a super long commute and live in a safe neighborhood, all these things. So when you're like, oh, when you are blasé about these things, you don't realize that it's trickling down to people who live in very different worlds and environments, and they are hearing things that are convenient to them or reassuring to them, which actually the message should be passed up and down the social hierarchy that like, look, being more careful is better than being not careful enough. And so it's like during COVID when people are like, I'm healthy. And then it's like, yeah, you are, but not everyone is like you. And so to insist that everyone who's hearing this message is at an equal place is not true, and you have to be responsible about what you say and do.
Right. But where are our gaps?
Oh, what do you think we could do better on? I mean, I think everyone can do better on how they strap their kids in because you're like they're fighting you or they're tired or whatever. I think that's an obvious one. I think we probably, speaking of the car, I think most people, including us, probably do things in the car that don't need to be done at all, right? Like you're like, did you actually need to take that drive? Yes or no? Probably not. Like, so you're just sort of spending more time like just exposed generally. I think everyone gets casual about stuff that they leave out, and you think it won't like that terrible thing won't happen to me.
Oh, like in your house?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's like knives on the kitchen counter, or if you're someone who has a gun, or
oh, that's one that you and I talked about recently. Guns. About like, especially living in Texas, swimming pools, like guns or whatever, before our kids go over to people's houses. Like
having awkward conversations
you have to be able to
outside
have
your
the awkward,
environment.
be comfortable having the awkward conversation. Like it's like be comfortable saying like, do you have guns in your house? Where do you keep them? How are they stored? Like, we in our family, we don't have secrets with our children. They will come home and we're going to talk about the things that are talked about in your home. Like be more comfortable having those awkward conversations with the parents up front, so you don't have to have those conversations. Like,
yes. Also, like I think medication is another thing you'd put in that category where it's like, I put it on the counter, and it's like, yeah, your kid 99% of the time doesn't seem to have a death wish, but the one time that you're like, oh, they're not going to touch it. You don't know.
Yeah.
And so I think those are all things, again, where it's better to be safe than sorry.
Right. And like, right.
Well, I was hoping you'd write this article for me, but I still have a bunch I have to think about.
I mean, I've been tricking you into doing my homework for me for like 16 years. Don't get me to start doing yours now. I didn't give you enough material.